Mortarion was my favorite Primarch. Many years ago, when the only actual depictions of him were the Grim Reaper-esque aspect associated with his earliest artwork and epic-scale Warhammer 40k minis, I couldn't get enough of the Pale King. But times have changed, and it's been more than 20 years since Games Workshop decided to flesh out all the Primarchs and give us more than the Index Astartes articles in White Dwarf. We've seen the Horus Heresy come, and now conclude, in a huge series of novels. And well, my opinion of Mortarion has changed quite a bit. And while he's no longer my favorite Primarch, he does hold a special place as the first Primarch that I did call favorite. So, what is it about him that has the community so convinced that he sucks so bad, despite being one of the most powerful beings in the setting? I think it comes down to hypocrisy myself, and how he narked on Magnus only to become the very thing he said he hated. And the downfall of Mortarion, well, it is tragic, but it isn't quite like he didn't have a hand in his own downfall. Mortarion, like any great villain, any great character, is multifaceted. So in this video, we'll look at the lore behind the Daemon Primarch, the Reaper of Men, the Pale King, the Death Lord himself. He's not for everyone, not even among Chaos players, fans, followers, and worshippers, but he is extremely loved by those who do appreciate him. Oh yeah, before we get into this, I forgot to mention, another really valid reason that people hate this guy for is he's really just a giant dickhead. I mean, a total asshole of the highest tier. A dour, sour, brooding, uncaring, callous, heartless bastard that is really hung up on himself and internalizes all the negativity that comes his way and weaponizes it as vitriol so potent it is literally venomous. And while that does make him an incredible villain, it also makes him unlikable to some people, even as a character. Okay, so Mortarion was scattered through the warp, like all the Primarchs, and as the infant demigod he was, ended up on the feral world of Barbarous, a world ruled by vying factions serving warlords that ravaged the planet, not unlike Terra during the Unification Wars. But Barbarous was pre-industrial. Its most advanced, readily available technology was steam-based, a proto-steampunk setting where the humans lived in constant fear of those who dwelt above, the warlords living in the gas-covered mountains. And Mortarion was found by one of the strongest of all the warlords, actually the strongest, a being named Nakari. The infant Primarch was in the middle of the aftermath of a great battle, the dead bodies and detritus of war strewn about all around him as far as the eye could see. But Nakari heard his wailing among all the carnage, and he searched until he found the Primarch. Now, what he found, well, it appeared human, but the planet was covered in toxic gas, and humans could only survive in certain places, in the lowlands, and Nakari and his people would come down from on high, from their mountain strongholds among the toxic deadly vapors, and raid the humans and take them away into the deadly clouds. The baby was an anomaly, who shouldn't have been able to survive at those heights. What the Lords of Barbarous did is a bit mysterious, but they certainly weren't human, and were definitely down with dark powers, warp powers, evil chaos gods. Dark necromancers who could resurrect the dead and fielded armies of zombies. The taint of Nurgle was already felt on Barbarous. So Mortarion was raised as the son of this war master, and basically taught from infancy the arts of warfare and being a total dickbag. Eventually Morty grew up a bit and wanted to know about the pathetic creatures in the valleys below. He knew the overlords of Barbarous would prey on these beings and use them as subjects in their necromantic arts, fielding armies of these pathetic little creatures known as humans. Eventually his curiosity got the better of him, and little Mortarion sneaks out of the keep where he is held, slaughters the hell out of the guards at the gate, because who could stand against a Primarch when he's going through puberty? And Morty makes his way down the mountains, through the toxic mist, and finds the valleys below. And what the Lord of Death sees is that the people there are the same species as he is. He basically learns that he's a human, and the people that the overlords are oppressing are his own. So the young Primarch swears to protect them from his father and the others like him. But nobody wants to trust him. He's creepy and weird and he smells bad. Plus nobody has taught him to take a bath or even basic hygiene. But Mortarion is stubborn, and he's determined to not only join the humans, but to save them from his father and the other overlords. So he helps bring in the harvest, working Primarch hard to prove himself to the people, who over time come to regard him as an asset rather than a liability. I really hope someone convinced him to take a shower and put on some deodorant, but somehow I doubt it. And what really earned him favor with the humans was when a warband from one of the overlords came raiding and the people were unable to mount an effective defense. So Mortarion joins the melee and comes in swinging a scythe and just reaping fools down. After all, his childhood was spent learning to fight and how to conduct warfare. He mops up the raiders who came down fronting on his people, and the main warlord who came down is like, oh crap, and he fades into the mist. Stepping into the toxic gas, he ascended to a height that the humans couldn't go, thinking he had made it to safety. He smiled at Morty, who just charged right into the toxic gas unlike any human this guy had ever seen, and Mortarion reaped him down like wheat too. So the Primarch became a hero to the villagers and was accepted finally. He taught them how to fight. He taught them what he knew, how to survive the onslaughts of the warlords. Basically, you can hear the training montage playing in the background as he forges the villagers into a fighting force of extraordinary magnitude. And yes, that was a fistful of yen reference. But words travel fast, and Morty had folks coming from other villages, all wanting to learn how to survive, basically. These people aren't thriving, they're barely surviving, and were the prey of the overlords and their zombie armies. Armies that were kept up to strength by the use of necromancy and reanimating human corpses. Imagine fighting off the zombie horde and it is all your reanimated neighbors and friends and family. Yeah, that's what the people of Barbarous were literally going through. Now, Morty found the most hardened men he could and turned them into his elite warriors. He got the blacksmiths all forging weapons instead of tools, and they created suits of armor. Basically, very, very crude power armor that allowed them to be enclosed and to go fight in the toxic gas. Mortarion and his boys, his death guard, pressed on. They took the fight to the overlords of Barbarous, and they rolled over many of the unsuspecting necromancers. They fought on, taking peak after peak and adapting their armor as they went, as they learned, and they got to the point where only the highest peak remained, the stronghold of Nakare. Morty's dad, well, his adoptive father. Mortarion is still a human being on some level, and he didn't want to go kill his father, despite the fact that he was the most evil guy on the planet, the High Overlord. But he kind of got an out when Callus Typhon, who would later become Typhus, the Herald of Nurgle, told him that he was not yet ready to face his father. Not even with the new suits of armor, and not even after all their victories. Mortarion agreed, and they returned home with only the one warlord left standing. But hey, taking out every warlord and leaving only one was a lot of hard work, and it was time for Morty and the Death Guard to go home. Kick up their feet and burn a couple fatties, have a few brews, and relax for a minute. But when they get there, a mysterious stranger has arrived. Just like so many of the other Primarchs, the Emperor of Mankind showed up to claim him. But he was in disguise, as usual. Morty was a bit offended that the stranger suggested that the villagers and himself needed help. But the stranger was talking about salvation for Barbarous with the village elders, and salvation sounded good. So the stranger issues a challenge to his son, Mortarion. He says he'll leave if Mortarion can defeat Nakare, the final overlord. But if he can't, then he must bend the knee and join the Imperium of Man the stranger was an agent of. So yeah, at this point, Big E's fronting like he's a representative of the Imperium, which isn't exactly untrue, just not the whole truth. So Mortarion climbs the highest peak, and this is after he's already decided not to go fight his old adoptive father, after Callus Typhon already convinced him their strength was insufficient. Basically, Mortarion fights his way to the top, climbs the highest peak, and gets all the way to Death Adder himself, the final boss, and he succumbs to the toxic gases. Yes, I am face-palming. He choked on the gases at the gates of Nakare's fortress, and as his consciousness is fading, as he's blacking out, he sees through the toxic fog. Nakare is approaching him as he chokes, taunting him and telling him he's a failure and he's pathetic. Then, before the High Overlord could deliver the killing blow, Mortarion glimpses the stranger shanking the hell out of the necromancer with a flaming sword. And when Morty was choking on the fumes, he'd heard a voice in his head trying to share with him the way to cheat death. He didn't know it, but it was Papa Nurgle, who had already chosen Mortarion to be his greatest mortal champion. So, N'Kari was toppled, his power overthrown. And Morty was true to his word. He swore fealty to the stranger, found out it was his father, found out he was a Primarch, and was given command of the 14th Legion of Space Marines, the Dusk Raiders. And the Dusk Raiders had a martial tradition of their own already well established. But they changed their iconography and their name to that of Mortarion's retinue from Barbarous, the Death Guard. So the seed of enmity was planted within Mortarion's heart. He was deeply wounded that he didn't get to end N'Kari. Mortarion may not have even known it at the time, but the bitterness would grow and fester into something monstrous. I think it was at this point that Mortarion could have gone a different direction, and he could have become a good man, but he did not. He fought across the stars, claiming worlds for the Imperium, bringing them into compliance just as he was ordered. But he didn't bond with the Dusk Raiders that were Terran-born and were in the Legion before he was found. He moved the Legion's headquarters effectively to Barbarous, and he started recruiting the strongest men of the world to become his new Astartes, Space Marines born from the harshest of toxic environments. And they had vastly different cultures and means of making war and martial traditions than the Terrans, and a rift formed within the 14th Legion. Mortarion's arc is quite long, and it goes in many different directions, many different ways. But one of the constant themes is that it all comes back to nature and nurture, and the fact that Mortarion was nurtured by a warlord who was a Nurgle necromancer and wasn't necessarily even human. Whatever he was is not fully known, but Mortarion was raised in corruption in a way that none of his other brothers were. Literally brought up by a chaos sorcerer warlord, his feet were put upon the path of damnation the moment he was found on Barbarous. So the Death Guard developed a very strong reputation as being completely implacable, resilient, and horrific to fight. The longer they were in the field, the more they got rid of iconography and traditions that still tied them to the Dusk Raiders and traditions of Terra. The more they became Mortarion's Death Guard. And Morty himself believed that the ends justified the means, and was willing to do whatever, but also to endure whatever for humanity, for the Imperium. And he believed that humanity should be like that too, willing to commit any atrocity or act of violence so long as it furthered the cause of and perpetuation of mankind. None of his brothers really liked him. He was, after all, the stinky kid. Plus he had some skin problems and was completely hairless and pale. He kept globes filled with toxic gases from Barbarous just a huff. I mean, it should have been apparent that Mortarion needed help of some sort. The guy was unhinged, but he was effective on the battlefield. And Horus used the Death Guard alongside the Sons of Horus often. He would have them engage the enemy, holding firm with their implacable will to halt any advance. Then, as the enemy was grinding itself down on the Death Guard, he'd send the Sons of Horus and smash the enemy between an anvil and the hammer. Mortarion, the Lord of Death, was very, very effective on the battlefield. But the Death Guard did not stay around and rebuild anything. They kept on grinding, kept on smashing their way through the galaxy, unlike many of the other legions. They spread like an unstoppable force. But some of his brothers were concerned that he did not necessarily seem to be completely loyal to the Emperor. And they'd be right. Gilliman noted that Mortarion was loyal to Horus, not the Emperor. And Big E disregarded that, stating that loyalty to Horus was de facto loyalty to him, so it didn't matter. But the only brothers that liked Mortarion were Horus and Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter. And the only ones who would otherwise have anything to do with him at all were the other outcasts like Lionel Johnson and Jagatai Khan. But Mortarion wasn't really the kind of guy who cared about that sort of stuff. He was who he was, and he acted how he acted, and if you didn't like it, you could kick rocks. So as he changed the culture and the focus of his legion, he purged the librarians from the ranks of the Death Guard. And there was no love in his heart for psychers. Mortarion equated psychers and psychic powers and their use with N'Kari and the necromancers of Barbarous. And when the Council of Nicaea happened, and Magnus the Red was basically put on trial for his use of sorcery, Mortarion was the one who pretty much hammered the last nail in that coffin. He gave a quick, concise speech revealing that he'd seen the use of sorcery on Barbarous, and that any humans in the Imperium who considered themselves loyal to the Emperor would avoid it at all costs. So the Emperor outlawed sorcery except for licensed astropaths and navigators, and the Space Marine legions were ordered to disband their librarians, and the librarians were to return to just being line troops. Mortarion had won a victory that probably crippled the Imperium. It led Magnus to breaking the Edict of Nicaea and destroying the Webway project, and it ultimately led to the dark fate the Imperium fell into. And in hindsight, as of the 41st millennium, Mortarion is one of the strongest psychers in the whole setting, and very, very hypocritically so. I have to say that it seems to me that the Emperor should have paid more attention to how his son Morty was already corrupted, steeped in Nurgle sorcery since infancy. And how he let Mortarion wield Nakari's old scythe is beyond me, as that would most likely be a demon weapon corrupted by the Plague God. I think when it came to the Primarchs, one of the two things is true as far as the Emperor goes. Either he was suffering from major blind spots where his sons were concerned, bordering on absolute negligence, or, and this makes more sense to me, the Emperor of Mankind, the new man himself, Neoth, knew that Nurgle had laid claim to his 14th son, and he accepted that. It's part of the deal he made with the Chaos Gods on Moloch. He knew he'd screwed over the old four and stolen from them, and he knew there'd be a price to pay for that, or it was actually part of the bargain. Either way, it seems that the Emperor had made peace with the fact that some of his sons were corrupted, and it may have just all been a part of his plan. A plan that got massively out of hand, but he in his hubris thought he could manage and control. After all, we know that the Emperor and Malcador did indeed pit the Primarchs against one another, playing chess with the galaxy. It was all just a game to them. A game that set them both on fire and put the Emperor into a state of eternal suffering as it backfired in ways they did not foresee. But this is where we get to the Horus Heresy, and it is not hard at all for Horus to get Mortarion onto his side. Mortarion respected Horus, and he loathed the Emperor. He thought the Emperor a huge hypocrite. When Mortarion found out about the Golden Throne and the fact that the Emperor was a psyker, not too different from Nakari himself on Barbarous, Mortarion felt betrayed. He'd never let go of the Emperor stealing his kill either. And all it took was Horus telling Mortarion that Big E had used the powers of the warp to create the Primarchs, which was true, but it didn't set well with Mortarion. So he joined Horus, and the traitor cause had one of the strongest of all the legions on their side. But Captain Callus Typhon, who had been born on Barbarous and had fought with Mortarion as his second in command, the same guy who advised they weren't strong enough to take on Nakari, he was already corrupted by the ruinous powers. He'd been a chaos worshipper under everyone's nose, and he had been spreading the influence of Nurgle through the Legion. At Istvan III, the infamous first strike of the Horus Heresy, the Primarch Mortarion and his Death Guard purged about 1/3 of the Legion. Those deemed too loyal to the Emperor and not loyal enough to Mortarion and Horus were purged. This consisted mostly of Terran-born Marines, and it effectively ended any and all influence those Terran Death Guard Legionnaires' traditions still had within the Legion, and they were massacred. Nathaniel Garro escaped with the Eisenstein and got word to Rogel Dorn that the War Master Horus had turned traitor and taken other legions and Primarchs with him. But the fate of the Death Guard was sealed that day, irrevocably. They were on the path to total damnation, the same as their Primarch. And Mortarion had become the ultimate traitor, massacring his own legion and committing infanticide. Then he went on to send his legion against the Loyalists at Istvan V, the atrocity that would become known as the Dropsite Massacre. They took part in the butchery of the Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands legions. Later, as the White Scars fleet was making its way to Prospero to find the truth, they were unsure who was friend and who was foe, or even what side they were on. They were followed by Mortarion, and the Pale King made his way to the planet's surface, to the city of Tizca, and he confronted the Khan on the planet's surface with 6 of his retinue in tow, the Death Shroud Terminators. There was a lot of banter, and the Lord of Death tried to persuade the Warhawk of Chagoris to join the traitors. Khan kept refusing. One thing about Mortarion, He lacked a lot of the charisma that the other Primarchs had. I mean, he didn't have the power to compel others the way Horus or his father, the Emperor, had, even though he'd fallen for being psychically compelled himself by the Emperor when he was sent to dispatch Nakare or bend the knee. He should have realized this power was somewhere within him, but like other things that were lying dormant within Morty, he was unaware. He tried to appeal to the Khan on the level of just basic logic, and Khan took the bait and chewed on it and spit it right back out into Mortarion's face. But this not working did not deter Morty too much. He let Jagatai Khan know that their father was a huge hypocrite, a sorcerer, and was using the warp, and also created them with the help of chaos and the warp. Khan still didn't come over to his side, and I feel like this is part of the flawed nature that is Mortarion's character. He could not be compelling, even in the slightest. He thought the facts would do the work for him, but he should have appealed to the Khan's heart, not his mind, just as Horus had done with him. It seems that many of the Primarchs' main blind spot is themselves, and Mortarion is no different. Khan tells him he's a bitch, and that he's going to become a slave to the very powers that he'd fallen in with, and they were going to require him to pay a price, and he wasn't going to like it. He told Morty that overthrowing Big E was dumb, as replacing him with Horus would just make another emperor and one who liked chaos. So Morty throws out that one of them will then overthrow Horus because, of course, basic villainy 101. But Khan just isn't feeling it, stating that they're both meant to be outriders, not emperors, and that he chose to embrace being a space biker where Mortarion was in denial. Khan keeps it outlaw, and he's already familiar with the cartels he's forced to work for. Doesn't want a change in leadership, even if it is him. Khan just wants to go fast, and I can respect that. So they fought, a fiercely terrible battle, and Mortarion let him know that half the White Scars had already declared for Horus, and the other half were waiting to see what side the Khan came down on and were going to join him no matter what. And the Death Guard fleet would destroy them if they stayed loyal. Khan still didn't break. Mortarion's pitch wasn't exactly the most appealing, though. So there was a warrior lodge within the White Scars that were loyal to Horus, and they had been coordinating with the Death Guard. But the intel they provided proved to be inaccurate, and Mortarion knew he'd have to lose a ton of ships to take out the White Scars fleet, so he bounced, and he tore through the old prospering empire, and finally got to the world of Terrathalion, where he bombards the planet, sends in drop pods of troops to massacre everyone, and kidnaps a woman and takes her back to his flagship, the Endurance. But she's not just a regular lady, she's actually possessed by a demon. Mortarion had always believed his father, the Emperor, who said such beings did not exist, and there one was before him. He interrogates the demon and wants to know why Fulgrim and Lorgar consort with such beings. He still hates Psykers and the Warp and wants nothing to do with it, but after realizing that all his brothers that also sided with Horus are just totally warp-addicted chaos thralls and trying to get his last almost friend on their side with the Khan at Prospero, he's getting desperate for something to hold on to and someone to be in his corner, which is something that Mortarion has never really had. Even in having his back against Nakare, the Emperor screwed him over, as far as Mortarion is concerned. Morty wants to understand the warp so that he can combat it, or at least that's what he's telling himself. But the demon tells the desperate Mortarion that he's already a pawn, claimed by the Plague God. She taunts him and teases him and really pisses him off, so he tries to beat the crap out of her, being the superhuman Primarch he is, but the transhuman strength was not adequate to take her. And she lets him know that if he truly wants to know the truth, then she'll show it to him. And she shed the human form and stood before him in her true state, as a giant, nasty insectoid monstrosity. And he fought her, punching and kicking, but he couldn't take her out. So eventually Mortarion unleashed something from deep within himself, something that had been hidden, lying dormant his entire life. Mortarion, the self-hating asshat that he was, turned on his full psychic potential. He was indeed a psyker himself, and he blasted this demon back to the warp, kicking her ass and being revealed to himself for the first time, and her voice echoed back to him as he kicked her back to hell. "Hail, Master of the Plague." He pulverized what was left of her body after the demon left, smashing her over and over with his Primarch fists. Mortarion was pissed. But now he was in a conundrum. He had to reconcile with the fact that he was everything that he hated. Mortarion was a psyker, and decided to embrace that. He swore that he'd be a master of the warp, though, not its slave. He began his new career as traitorous warp witch, a Primarch psyker from the wrong side of the tracks, standing up to the man, sticking it to the system. Now Mortarion was free to be the true rebel he was born to be. Or maybe, just maybe, he literally became the replacement for, and the mirror image of, Nakari, the High Overlord Necromancer of Barbarous himself. Mortarion had become everything he'd ever hated, and more. Everything he had ever fought against, in his mind at least. He became that personified, an avatar of chaos. The Primarch who thought himself master of the warp, yet should have heeded the words of his brother Jagatai. So Mortarion and his Death Guard Legion weren't going to miss out on the party, and they headed to Terra to assault the throne world alongside Horus and the others. But things got really, really messed up for them. Callous Typhon, the chaos-worshipping first captain of the Death Guard, kills all the navigators on the ship, claiming they are still loyal to the Emperor. So without any navigators, Mortarion had to trust Typhon, who said he had a special gift that would see them through the warp safely as they traveled, and they didn't need navigators anyway. But of course, this was all just a ploy to deliver the Death Guard Legion and their Primarch into the clutches of Nurgle, the Plague God. They got lost in the warp and eventually infected with the Destroyer Plague and Nurgle's Rot both. Two infections you really don't want to get. The Death Guard bloated and swelled and mutated, and even their ships became altered. Even the hulls of the fleet suffered from the infection. It was agony, and they could not die. They begged for an ending to their suffering. Their enhanced transhuman physiognomy, no protection at all against the foulness of Nurgle. And they couldn't die. Imagine being stuck in such a state. It's a literal version of hell. Mortarion had it the worst, and it was like a flashback for him. He felt like he was on Barbarous again, choking on the toxic fumes, but the Emperor was not there to save him. His agony was so extreme that he bargained with Chaos to set him and his legion, and his fleet, free. And the Plague God finally had his strongest mortal champion in his service, as his thrall, completely and utterly. So of course Nurgle delivered on his part of the bargain. He stopped the pain for the most part, and the Plague Marines were born. So the Death Guard go to Terra, but they were the last to show up on behalf of Chaos, and Mortarion's stench could not be contained and overwhelmed everyone on the Vengeful Spirit except for Abaddon, the demon Torgadon known as Tormageddon, and Horus. So the War Master lets them be the first troops to hit the ground. He's like, "Go, you smell so bad you're making my eyes bleed, and your reeking stench has killed off several of my sons of Horus Astartes." I think if I was Mortarion, I might just chop my first captain into little pieces and keep each one in a separate jar and launch them all into different suns, but that's just me. I'm not a fan of being manipulated, and Callous Typhon was a master manipulator. In the end, he felt justified in what he did, as it brought Nurgle, his chosen champion, Mortarion, willingly. But Typhon was now Typhus, and Typhus was something altogether beyond what he'd started as. Mortarion did fight on the ground, and was leading the first force of Chaos's massive numbers against the throne, but he didn't try to breach the palace's psychic shields like his brothers did. He had Typhus go help Perturabo enact a Nurgle ritual to bring them down, but he was personally overwhelmed by his new visage, and Chaos was eating him alive. The agony had returned for Mortarion. But honestly, some of the Chaos Primarchs were really stand-up dudes, and his brother Magnus helped him learn to use his psychic powers to control the pain and to control his now warp-infused existence. Mortarion takes on his loyalist son, Nathaniel Garro, who he slays, and it is sad because Garro is one of my all-time favorite Space Marines from any timeline, from any setting, even outside of 40k. Yeah, that sucked. But Garro bought time for Euphrates Keeler to escape and get to safety, and he died a massive hero, and he also delivered a serious wound to Mortarion by stabbing him in the neck with a broken blade, kind of reminiscent of Conan chopping Thulsa Doom in the neck. Anyway, that made me not like Morty as much, as a person. not as a character. And of course, Mortarion has another showdown with the Khan, who somehow has now become his nemesis. And this fight is brutal as hell. But after the Iron Warriors and Perturabo quit the field and up and left, Mortarion was called on to step up and lead, and the Khan counterattacked him at the Lionsgate spaceport. Mortarion was torqued up with all the Nurgle sauce. Ugh, that's just pus, I guess, but yeah, he couldn't be resisted or stopped, and he beat the Khan down. He stomped Khan, but he didn't completely destroy him. He literally stood over his brother and could have ended him, but Jagatai used the strongest weapon he had against Mortarion. Words. And the words stung. He called Morty a little chaos bitch again, and he said he was too much of a slut to resist the warp and stay loyal. Khan's words bit deep, and Mortarion impaled the Khan for this. But here's where Jagatai was inspired by King Arthur from the Excalibur movie and pulled himself along the blade right up to Mortarion and decapitated him. This classic move, while seldom used in fiction, is always so badass, and the few instances of it really stand out to me. Here, let me just pull my impaled body down the length of the spear or sword, or in this case scythe, that I'm impaled upon and just chop you down, fool. That is indeed a Primarch move, and something Mortarion didn't seem to expect at all. But he is a servant of Nurgle, and his death went off like an A-bomb, but it didn't end him permanently. The Death Guard, then, were the only legion to casually leave the heresy. To pack up their things, and drive away fighting a grinding war of attrition the whole way. Other legions simply ran away, ramshackle, retreating as chaotically as possible to the Eye of Terror. But the 14th fought on effectively, calmly. They just left and made it to the Eye of Terror. And when they got there, were reunited with Mortarion in the warp. He became a demon prince, the shit moth, who had a plague planet of his own that he made in his own image of torment and suffering. Mortarion had truly become everything he hated: a sorcerer, a tyrant, a demon. Too bad hypocrisy wasn't higher on the list of things he hated. And Mortarion was transformed into a demon prince. And not the cool skeleton demon prince like his epic 40k model from way back in the day. I think my friend still has this mini. I should try to get it off of him. But no, he's the sewage moth we know today. Still the very image of death itself, just not quite the literal Grim Reaper and more specifically Nurgle-coated. But I do really miss the bat-like wings, the serpent tail, and the skeletal form of the original. It definitely didn't scream Nurgle like the current Warhammer 40k mini does, but I digress. This was supposed to be a lore video, so getting back on track. Sewage moth! Yeah, Mortarion is a literal nightmare now. Face rotted off, no nose at all, his rebreather gummed up with tons of mucus and sludge, his lungs full of pus and maggots, and it is glorious. He truly did become the chosen of the Plague Father. And since the Horus Heresy, Mortarion has been a thorn in the side of the Imperium for 10,000 years, having a very heavy influence on the setting, from killing a Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, and then having that master's name carved into his heart because the next master knew his true name that the Emperor had meant for him, and true names are a really big deal in 40k, blah 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 run-on sentence. He did a lot of stuff despite this, though. But yeah, Mortarion slaughtered many entire worlds to try and goad Guilliman into a fight after the 13th Primarch's resurrection. And eventually, he spread plagues and destruction so far and wide and thoroughly that he did end up in one-on-one conflict with the Lord of Ultramar, the Avenging Sun. And he hit Guilliman with the Godblight Plague, a disease that could end a Primarch. It didn't work. Well, it did, but then the literal Emperor possessed Guilliman and brought him back to life and puppeted him, banishing Mortarion and setting fire to the literal Garden of Nurgle itself, wounding the actual Plague God. Okay, so that's over the top, and they really dunked on Morty. After all he's been through. He finally gets a win, and the damn Emperor of Mankind literally robs it from him again? From his hover-round on the other side of the galaxy, even. And Mortarion just doesn't seem to be able to catch a break. Oh yeah, and he's doing all that against Nurgle's will and direct orders, along with Kugoth, the Plague Father, the Great Unclean One, who created the Godblight. He's no longer in favor with Nurgle at this time, or at least not as high of a status as before. I think they can reconcile. Nurgle's all happy and huggy and loves his people more than any of the other Chaos gods, maybe more than the Emperor, so they can make up, I know it. But Mortarion, he's a Demon Primarch, a Demon Prince of Nurgle, and an ambitious player in the Great Game. He hurt the Plague God by disobeying him. Not intentionally, but nonetheless. And Chaos fights Chaos more than anything or anyone else. That's probably the main reason they don't just conquer everything and totally win the entire setting. And yes, I know exactly how ridiculous that sounds, but Chaos could actually win the setting. But the most notable infighting that Mortarion has been involved in was when he and his Death Guard descended upon the same world to plunder the same temple's secrets as his brother Perturabo and his Iron Warriors. So the War of Rust and Ruin ensued, and this was right after the Great Rift tore the galaxy in half. Perturabo and Mortarion both wanted something held in the Temple of Ascension on the world of Dissactus, and they came to conflict when they ran into each other. And Perturabo had both Iron Warriors and Chaos Titans from Legion Eborix on his side. At first they were stomping the Death Guard, well, as much as one can stomp hulking bloated pus bags and make a difference. But eventually the armor, weapons, and even the marines of the Iron Warriors began to corrode. The Titans rusted and decayed. Nurgle won out and rusted the Lord of Iron. Mortarion was busted, battered, and bruised, but his stanky moth ass was triumphant against one of the greatest military strategists that ever existed. Truly, Nurgle is horrifying, and truly, Mortarion is his greatest servant.